Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Book Trek 2022. This is a BookTube event that I'm involved with. It was created by Vin at Revenant Reads. He's gathered together a handful of really good booktubers to talk about Star Trek fiction for August and September. So for August, we'll be doing The Wrath of Book Trek, where we talk about basically old friends, known quantities. I'm interpreting that as everything done under the broad umbrella of the influence of Gene Roddenberry. So the original series and the animated series and all the movies that came from the original series, The Next Generation and the movies that came from The Next Generation, plus Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise. And after that, there's a chasm. And on the other side of that chasm are the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies that take place in an alternate Kelvin timeline, and also New Trek, Alex Kurtzman Trek, that is now up to, almost half a dozen shows. And that new era of Star Trek we'll deal with in September. So for August, I'm reading older stuff. And for me, that involves a large amount of rereading. When it comes to the original show, the original cast, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, I read those novels as they came out. They were, for a while there, a booming business. So they came out regularly. And I read them all, and for a while I tried to piece them together into some coherent mosaic, like you could theoretically do with the Star Wars Extended Universe. But the Star Wars Extended Universe had people that sort of rode shotgun on it to make sure that no one book drastically contradicted any other book, which makes that tapestry possible. It also is the reason why so many Star Trek Extended Universe books are so boring, because they're kind of straitjacketed. You can't really do that with Star Trek novels. I don't think anyone ever really tried, although some writers of Star Trek fiction did want to either continue their own concepts that they had created for a Star Trek novel, or continue other people's concepts. And I ran into that today with the novel that I reread. I read this when it first came out, and I reread it last night. It's Jean Deweese, and it's Chain of Attack. Sorry about the crappy lighting here. But this continues ideas that occurred in one of the earliest Star Trek novels, Abode of Life, which is not by Jean Deweese. It's by an author whose name is escaping me. Corey, I think, is the last name. Will this be any better? I hold it up over here. Not really. Well, at least it doesn't have the glare. This continues ideas that were invented in that novel, and I think, though, if I remember correctly, those ideas were continued after this. I knew the events of Abode of Life a lot more, had them more at my mental fingertips 20, 30 years ago than I did when I reread this last night. And that was good in a way, because that allows me with more clear eyes to estimate how good this book is on its own as a book. And I have to say, it works rather well. You don't need to read Abode of Life to read this and get what's at stake. But the book, the basic story here is that the Enterprise is investigating a series of gravimetric anomalies. They can't explain it. They can't explain their frequency. They can't explain their power, and they seem sometimes to be able to move objects that enter them across vast distances, whole parsecs of space. And the Enterprise wants to understand this naturally for a whole bunch of reasons, including that these are potential navigation dangers. When suddenly they go through one of these anomalies and are thrown into another galaxy. So they're thrown clear out of the Milky Way galaxy and into a galaxy they don't recognize, but that seems to be a long, long way from home. As we're told fairly early on in the novel, once the Enterprise crew realizes what's going on, once they realize they're not near anything that they recognize, they start to realize that even at maximum warp with no deviations, it would take them centuries to get back to Federation space. And if that sounds a bit familiar, that plot, well, that means you've been watching Roddenberry-era Star Trek, because that is basically the plot of Star Trek Voyager. That's the premise of Star Trek Voyager, is that Voyager is caught, in this case, not by a gravimetric anomaly, but by a sentient, super powerful alien race, and thrown not into another galaxy, but to the other end of the Milky Way galaxy, which is still an unworkable distance. Once Voyager realizes in the early episodes where they are, they realize that at maximum warp, with no deviations at all, it would take them 70-something years to get back to Federation space. Virtually a death sentence for most of the people on board, and certainly a sentence to be a stranger to the world that they get to. And that's to say nothing of the fact that a straight line course at maximum warp with no deviations is not possible. So the crew of Voyager, decades after this book came out, is faced with an essential question. I mean, Captain Janeway, we'll talk about Voyager a lot when I reread some Voyager books, but Captain Janeway is forced to decide what to do when that happens. It's never explicitly stated, but it's pretty clear that although they will be making a course as straight as possible, as fast as possible for Federation space, a straight line with no deviations won't be possible. So what do you do? Now, Captain Janeway decides, well, we'll do what we took an oath to do. We're a Starfleet vessel. And all Starfleet offers is take an oath to serve, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations. Nowhere in that oath does it say we'll only do those things if we have 10 starships at our back. It says that's the oath that we're doing. So we will do that. In addition to trying to get back home, we will remain Starfleet. And the fact that, I mean, this book took place, the writer wrote this long before Voyager. I have no idea if maybe the showrunners that came up with Voyager had this book and its prequel and sequels in mind. It's a fairly obvious concept anyway. And it won't work the way this book does it, right? When this book starts, Kirk and company realize they will never get home. It's not possible. It will take centuries to do. With Voyager, for instance, some of the younger crew members would still be alive when they get back to Earth. Humans have a longer lifespan in the 23rd century. And, of course, the aliens on board, Spock, and we're told that there's at least one other Vulcan on board. They will live to reach Earth. But in the Enterprise at the beginning of this book, no, everyone would be dead. And that won't work as the premise for a story, right? Voyager can't have that as an opening premise, that there is no hope. We're never going to see the Federation again unless we find some miracle technology. That won't work. Here, that hope is more explicit. It's much more on the table. Because if you're reading this book, you know perfectly well that the author was not given permission by Paramount and the editors of this series to strand Captain Kirk and his crew in another galaxy forever, the end. They weren't given permission to do that. And they probably weren't given permission to write a multi-book series. So you know when you start this book that the Enterprise is going to find a way to reverse anomaly themselves back to their own galaxy. You know that's going to happen. They're going to find a way to get back home almost on the nose. So it's no spoiler for me to say that does eventually happen. But what Jean Deweese has to do in the meantime is fill this book with stuff. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of stuff that fills this book. And a lot of it is very interesting. This is a very scientifically technical book, but also very good. It's very well paced. Better paced than I remembered. The writer works in a lot of interpersonal drama. The various individuals in the key cast of the crew are put through various individual traumas. That keeps you hooked into the whole thing. There is an unlikable character at the beginning, a Federation civilian official. They're almost never portrayed well in Star Trek, despite the fact that Gene Roddenberry went out of his way over and over again to say that Starfleet is not an explicitly military organization, that it's more exploratory than military. He went out of his way to denigrate civilian busybodies, and there's the mother of all civilian busybodies, who's on board the Enterprise when they're examining these anomalies and are thrown across known space to another galaxy. And there is an inherent drama in figuring out what's going to happen to that character. The standard arc for those busybody civilians is that they have a moment of truth and realize that they have been living in an ivory tower and that the crew of the Enterprise knows best, and they become better for it. That also happens in the original series with a few paper-pushing admirals or upper-ups in Starfleet itself, who don't realize what the real life of the frontier and the real demands of a starship are like until they're exposed to it directly. You expect that kind of an arc for the character that I'm talking about in this book, and you do get it, but it's done on a much grander scale. the thing that characterizes the series of adventures that the core cast of characters have in this book as the book goes on is that those adventures get grander and grander. And they result, all of them, from the fact that when presented with this horrible decision, Kirk decides, I am still Starfleet. We are still Starfleet. We're not, now that we're, as far as he knows, trapped irrevocably far from the Federation, never to see it again, we're not going to suddenly start becoming a pirate ship and attacking weaker vessels in order to plumb their resources. In Star Trek Voyager, Janeway encounters a Federation vessel that was also flung across the galaxy and that did make that decision. And she scorns it. It makes her personally angry in a way we barely ever see her, any of the rest of the episodes of the show. And Kirk makes the same decision decades before that show, that we are still a Starfleet vessel. We will stay true to our principles, no matter where we are, and no matter whether or not we have the support of Starfleet. And I thought that was really neat. I don't know that I would have, I don't think there was a way for me to appreciate this novel as much when I originally read it as I did the second time last night when I read it knowing about Voyager, having watched and liked Star Trek Voyager. That's fascinating to me, that a later incarnation of a TV show can enhance my reread of a book. That was fascinating to me. I embraced it once I realized it was happening. And it also raises another issue that Star Trek fans, some Star Trek fans, love to mull around with, and that is to face one crew of one Star Trek show with the obstacle faced by a different crew of a different Star Trek show, just to sort of figure out how that would go. One of the ways that Star Trek fans that I have known have done that most often, and I have myself, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, there's a great two-part episode called The Way of the Warrior. And at the climax of that two-part episode, the Klingons momentarily turned against the Federation, and they have attacked the space station Deep Space Nine, where all of our cast is. They're all on board the station. And the station's force fields give out, and the Klingons manage to board the ship. And the Klingons, being Klingons, they're interested in hand-to-hand combat. They come on with energy weapons, and they are at first faced with energy weapons. But once the chaos becomes too pressing, hand-to-hand combat erupts everywhere on board Deep Space Nine. And it gives you a chance in that episode to see how the core cast of characters would fare if they all had to go up against an armed Klingon boarding party without the leveling of energy weapons. What would that be like? What would that conflict be like? Odo, the shapeshifter, would certainly be able to handle himself. Commander Worf, one of the finest Klingon combat artists, would certainly be able to handle himself wonderfully. I mean, Commander Sisko, the star of the show, it's necessary that he be able to handle himself against a Klingon. Wonderfully, though, the producers of the show also made sure that we saw that Jadzia Dax, who has a long familiarity with Klingon culture and Klingon weapons, who is a tall, statuesque woman in perfect physical shape, and who has centuries of combat experience, would also be able to handle herself hand-to-hand against a Klingon boarding party. And when fans watched that show, I immediately started spectating, so did everybody else, what would happen with other Star Trek crews if that happened. Like, for instance, people say, if it were the Next Generation, well, Picard is older. No one faults his courage, but in hand-to-hand combat against a younger Klingon, he might not fare that well. Riker, on the other hand, would do really well. And Data is a super being. He's super strong. So, Counselor Troi, probably not. Wesley Crusher, probably not. But Data would more than make up for that. Or the original show, Kirk fought his share of Klingons in hand-to-hand combat for a long time, not only on the original show, but for 20 additional years in the movies. And there's Spock, and Scotty, and Sulu, and you move on from there to all the other iterations of the show. I don't think, like for instance in Star Trek Enterprise, we know that Subcommander T'Pol can handle herself against an armed Klingon warrior. They show us that, so we know that. And that is a fun mental game with Star Trek, is to pit one cast against the thing faced by another cast. That was the huge attraction to making sure that the Enterprise in Star Trek Enterprise, a generation before Kirk and Spock and 100 years before Picard, faced the Borg. Even though it seems to strain continuity to the breaking point, fans wanted that. They wanted to see how that would work. It was no big deal for Voyager to face the Borg because Voyager had been flung into the Borg's home territory. That was only natural. But you want to see how other people will do, how other cast of heroes will do. And that is kind of the fun in retrospect, anachronistically, of this book, is that you get to see how the original crew would respond to something very similar to the dilemma that faces the Voyager crew. I liked it for that. That was the most interesting thing for me about rereading Chain of Attack, was that Voyager didn't exist the first time that I read this, and now that it did, it informs that reading. And made me immediately start to wonder about that and all sorts of other things, I mean, it's like, for instance, Q. We know how the Enterprise in the Next Generation cast responds to Q, and we can sort of guess how the original cast would do, because they do meet the Squire of Gothos, who in fan fiction for 50 years has been retrofitted as a member of the Q Continuum. And you start to wonder what other shows would be possible for. Q shows up on Voyager, for instance. And that was the principal joy of this. Although I don't mean to sell the novel short. It was really enjoyable, especially considering that the author was using concepts that the author didn't create, and that I didn't really remember the book in which those concepts are introduced all that well. It still worked really, really well. Lots and lots of tension, and you don't see a lot of the twists that are coming, except the final one, which is coming. You're not going to hold that against the book. So that's my book trek entry for today, which is it was a reread, but it really didn't feel like one, and it felt like a new reading experience for the strangest reason imaginable, because an entire show has intervened between when I read it the first time when I read it the second time. And that show had a very similar premise and changed my appreciation of a lot of the elements in the book. Only Star Trek, I tell you. But anyway, that's my book trek entry for today. We'll see what tonight's spin of the wheel gives us, and I'll see you later. Thank you, BookTube.